Now, when we first started talking about today's presentation, I was in the midst of coming back from a month in Australia and New Zealand, which I've now done a number of times. It was my 10th time in Australasia. I've done quite a bit of work with the courts there and enjoy it very much. It's become an annual event. And then, so that was sort of the focus. And then as Darlene said, something else happened about 2 weeks ago. So I've shifted it slightly, but it all does still come down to how do we deal with recidivism, people who are constantly rearrested over and over again? How do we tell the difference between the people who deserve a second chance, redemption, something, the restitution, all those things, and those we just have to put away because they can't live among us? And those are the people that we need to save the very expensive situation of state prison for. And we have to stop incarcerating the ones we're just mad at. So a lot of this comes down to the use of alcohol and other drugs. I was so surprised to find out how much of alcohol and other drug issues affect the criminal justice system. They, in fact, fuel most crimes, are present in the majority of cases of child abuse and neglect. They have an overwhelming negative impact on families and, of course, lead to premature death. Also, the economic cost of alcohol and other drugs is quite high. Illegal drugs about $181 billion a year, alcohol $185, and tobacco $158. Total of $524 billion we spend on these substances and suffer from the use of. If you look at the types of crimes that are committed and who's using what at the time of the incident, or who is committing the crime in order to purchase the drugs, they're all interrelated. You find that in over 50% of violent crimes, the perpetrator has alcohol or other drugs on board. About 60 to 80% of child abuse and neglect cases. So the perpetrator in that case loses his or her temper. It just came upon me, I snapped. Well, no, it was fueled first by the alcohol or other drugs. And 50 to 70% of theft and property crimes, and of course about 75% of drug dealing. Now you notice the date on that, 2010, they stopped this program. I was really sorry they did. But at the time, what they were doing is everybody who was arrested for any crime was given the chance 4 times a year on a particular date that was chosen, and they would be drug tested. It couldn't be used against them in their current case. It was just to get the statistics. And this is one of the last times they did it, I believe this was in the fall of 2010. And if you look at people arrested in Chicago, 82% had drugs on board. Sacramento, slightly less than that. Atlanta, somewhere around 60%. And the lowest was Washington, it's 50%. So even in the lowest city, half the people were at that moment of arrest under the influence of alcohol or other drugs. So what do we do about this? What can be done? We had a very clear policy of sort of lock them up, throw away the key for a while. It's an expensive option. If you noticed in California how much money we would spend, the Department of Corrections budget exceeded the Department of Education budget by millions of dollars. It costs $71,000 a year to house a prisoner in California. So you have to ask, who should be there? Who should be going to prison? Who does it make sense for, and who does it not? So judges have had different approaches on this. This is my approach when I was a young whippersnapper judge. I had a civil background when I took the bench, so of course they gave me a criminal assignment. And I did what I thought I was supposed to do. Someone pled guilty or they were found guilty, and I sentenced them to jail time. And I said, and I actually wagged my finger, and I said, and no more alcohol or other drugs for you. And I was really kind of shocked when they would come back. Imagine how naive I was. But if a judge said to me, no more alcohol, and if you drink, I'm putting you in jail, no problem, there goes the wine collection. All right, I give. That was not true for these folks. And they'd come back and I'd say, what about no? Didn't you understand? And I'd double the sentence and I'd triple the sentence and we'd go round and round. And I'd feel personally affronted by it. I told you not to do it, you did it anyway, and I'm going to punish you. Well, after about a year of that, I said to my probation officer, does anybody ever do what I ask them to? He says, yeah. I said, will you bring me one? Because I am so tired of seeing these failures over and over and over again. And by failures, I don't mean to impugn necessarily the integrity of the individual criminals who were coming in front of me. The whole system was a failure. Because clearly, incarcerating our way out of this problem was not the answer. So what happens if we just put them in jail? About a third of them get rearrested within 6 months, and 2/3 are rearrested within 3 years. So when you look at a program that's really effective, like drug courts, which we're going to talk to you about in a minute, then my question becomes, why isn't the Department of Corrections having a bake sale? Because their statistics are really bad. You know, people come back over and over again, and yet we're spending all this money on them. What happens when jail is the only answer is we get in the situation in which we found ourselves, which people all over the world look at us like we're mad as hatters. We reached a population of 2.3 million people in custody in 2008. That was sort of the height of the aftermath of the war on drugs and the lock 'em up, throw away the key mentality. We have about 5% of the world's population, and at any given time, at the height of that madness, between 25 and 50% of the prisoners, about 1 out of 133 Americans incarcerated at any given time. So if there's 133 people here, I suspect slightly more, at least one of you would be in prison. And 1 out of 31 adults on parole or probation. I'm going to guess that not many of you have probation officers. Just a guess, you don't have to raise your hand. But if you look at this crowd, that would be 4 or 5 people would be on probation or parole, some sort of supervision. So that's where we were. And finally, people figured out, you know, we've got to do something different. So people started changing their mind. They started thinking about this. People, the regular general public, started saying, hey, we think rehabilitation or the treatment of people in custody is more appropriate for nonviolent offenses. We don't want a prison full of nonviolent offenders who are there for drug cases, who could otherwise perhaps get a good intervention and be helped. The general public came to believe, 75%, that the most appropriate sentence for a person with a mental disorder was having an alternative to going to jail. A person who is mentally ill should not be in jail, and yet mental illness is the basis of about 50% of the people who are in custody. Very few people, fewer than 1 out of 5, believe that jail should be there to punish people, because we know it doesn't work. If it worked, you wouldn't have a recidivism rate of 2/3 back within 3 years. So this idea that maybe things weren't so fair, maybe things were not going so well, was starting to permeate. The politicians weren't quite getting the point yet, but the general public was starting to feel that way. And why is this so important to us in criminal justice when we talk about mental illness? 5 to 7% of the US population has a serious mental illness. But 14.5% of men and 31% of women in custody have a serious mental illness. So from 5% up to 1/3 almost of women have a serious mental illness if they're in custody. And when you look at participants in a drug court, which we are going to talk about in a minute, about 1/3 have a co-occurring disorder, meaning that they have a mental illness plus the substance use disorder. If you're dealing with somebody with a mental illness, not only is it very expensive, even more expensive to keep them in custody, let alone they are preyed upon, let alone they often end up in solitary confinement because of their behavior. Solitary confinement only further deteriorates their mental health status. They don't get proper medications many times, but they also have recidivism rates that are higher because what happens? They're turned out to the street. They don't get their proper medications. They don't get proper care. The promise of community care for people with mental illness never came true. That turned out to be a lie. And you look at the recidivism rates, they're nearly double for people without mental illness. They're more likely to have probation revocations, which means they're more likely to end up back in custody again, and they have the highest rates of parole violations. Anybody guess what the largest mental hospital in the United States is? Well, I hear rumma, 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 rumma. So I'll just tell you, LA County Jail. Any given day, there are 3,000 mentally ill inmates. This is the condition we were in when the federal court said, hey, you got to clean up your act and you have to release 34,000 people out of the prisons of California, which, we just did last year. They were triple bunking. This is actually the cafeteria. So during the day, they'd sort of push the beds aside and go on with business, then pull them back out at night to triple bunk them. We also, as you may recall, we passed Prop 36, which was the Treatment Over Incarceration Initiative. We passed Proposition 47, which then changed a lot of the felonies to misdemeanors. So again, the public was figuring out that this was not a smart thing to be doing. Just on Sunday, I believe it was, the 60 Minutes did a terrific program about the Chicago Cook County Jail. If you get a chance to take a look at it, it's really amazing. And one of the things that the warden talks about is the mental illness of the inmates. So that's what happens if we just incarcerate them. So great, let's give them treatment. Send them to treatment. That'll be the great thing to do. Well, between 1/2 and 2/3 don't show up for intake. Oh, oops. 40 to 80% drop out within 3 months of treatment. 90% drop out within 12 months. And the people who end up abstinent after a year are very, very few. That doesn't mean treatment doesn't work. It does. It doesn't mean that you can't have treatment that's effective and leads to people changing their lives without the intervention of jails. That's not what it means. It does mean for my people, for my population, for my little mentally ill criminals who also have substance use disorders, it's going to take the power of the court to help them get in place. So that's what drug courts are. Started in 1989, said there's got to be a better way to run a railroad. The second one started here in Oakland in 93, and I was lucky enough to chair the committee that set that up, so I've been at this for 30-some years now. And we're lucky here in Contra Costa County. We have domestic violence courts, driving while impaired courts, drug court, mental health court, elder abuse, and Prop 36 and Prop 47 courts. So we have specialist courts here in Contra Costa County. There are more than 3,000 drug courts in the United States now. And in California, there's about 210 drug courts and another 174 what are called problem-solving courts. So why do we need drug courts? Why do we look at drug courts? Why do we support drug courts? Easy. We can capitalize on the trauma and consequences of the arrest to intervene with appropriate offenders. If somebody's just, a goofball college kid who's getting into drugs and messing around and not studying and generally being a goofball 19-year-old, that's sort of redundant, they're probably not an addict. They don't need intensive treatment. They don't need to go to some live-in program up in Napa. They need, their parents and the court to shake them by the ears and say, knock it off, buddy. This is not going to happen, and you will be severely dealt with if you continue with this behavior. Because at that point, they have the ability to stop. Who needs a drug court is the person who can't stop. Despite every negative consequence, losing their children, going to prison, stealing from their mother or grandmother, all the things that they never thought they would do in 1,000 years, they do in order to get the drug, because substance use disorders are so overwhelming. So for people like that, our recidivists, the ones who are going to keep coming back over and over again until they address this problem, that's the drug courts. So they enter treatment sooner, they stay longer. We know that longer is better. They have the highest level of accountability because they're reporting to the courts, starting out every 2 weeks, then monthly, and it could be 12 to 24 months. They're in this program. It's not a short-term fix, because it was a long-term problem getting there. It's going to take a long time to get out. And the drug court concentrates on the high-risk, high-need offender. That's the person who is most likely to come back, most likely to cause problems, and most likely to continue the behavior unless we do something about it and intervene. So there's the key components to drug court. The biggest one, it's collaborative. It's not just the judge sitting there by herself. It is the judge making the ultimate decision, but you have a whole team. You have defense counsel, probation, you have community policing officers, you have treatment, you have mental health, you have a housing specialist. You have all these people in place that can bring the individual to the fore to give them the support they need to reach recovery. And ultimately, absolutely, it's their decision. They have to come to the place where they can do it themselves. But at first, they can't do that. They need the support of the court. They need, the tight structure. They need a curfew. They need strict rules. They need a monitor bracelet to make sure they're not drinking alcohol. And then slowly, as their behavior shows you that they can control themselves, you take off those controls, and they will have developed the internal locus of control, which is what we're going for. Because having him for 2 years and then turning him out and having him loaded the next day, what was that about? What did we just spend all this time on? I don't want to waste my time with you unless this is a long-term commitment and it's going to turn your life around. So do drug courts work? Yes, they do. There's so many meta-analysis now. When we started all this 30-some years ago, we didn't have any data. We just knew everybody felt good. And we had lots of anecdotes, but anecdotes do not make data. We now have data. I can show you from recidivism rates to cost savings, why drug courts work. And if you look at crime reduction, average 14 to 25%, 14%, 9%, 8%. Retention rates in treatment, not the person who got referred and didn't even show up for the first meeting, but drug court clients, 80 to 90% of them stay in. And they're the ones that end up actually working the program of treatment that can make that internal change that we're looking for in them. The average rearrest rate, this was a California study, this is great. Drug court graduates only 17% rearrested. Remember the other figures, 1/3 and 2/3? 17%. What about people who didn't graduate? They started in drug court, it didn't work, whatever reason, they dropped out. Even then, their recidivism rates are down to 29%. So just exposure to the court. I had somebody who came to see me probably 2 or 3 years after I had removed him from the program, and I saw him sitting there one day, and I looked again because, my God, he had teeth and a tie on and all these things that I had never seen when he was in my court. And I said, "So what happened to you?" He says, "You ruined my ability to get high." I said, "God, that's great." That's really wonderful. He had gone on, he got a certificate from the state, he was doing drug counseling, he was doing fantastically. So even though he didn't graduate, he's one of those statistics. If you compare a group exactly matched, you know, those statisticians can just do amazing things. Exactly matched, that group is 41% likely to come back. So 17 to 41, it's not even close. I mean, there's just hardly anything to discuss. If we look at cost analysis, the one that's highlighted in blue is a California study. For every dollar spent on treatment, $3.50 were saved. Overall, California is saving $90 million a year in drug courts and those other specialist courts that I told you about. The California Drug Court Study, the average savings, when you count everything, not just recidivism rates, but they now have a job, they're now paying taxes, they've cleaned up all their old warrants, they actually have a driver's license. What a concept. They're supporting their children. Oh my goodness. Maybe they've even gotten their children back from Child Protective Services. The savings are $11,000 per participant. So can we apply this to other models? Yes, we can. There's about 1,200 other kinds of problem-solving courts. I mentioned a few that we have here in Cocoa. Domestic violence, there's a prostitution court where people engaged in prostitution are no longer looked at as criminals so much as human trafficking victims. It's a whole different perspective that's being used now. Truancy court for kids who aren't going to school, gun courts, reentry courts, all kinds of using this same kind of collaborative model to help people. I just want to spend a couple seconds on DWI courts because we need more of those in California. For some reason, we're doing a horrible job of developing DWI courts. DWI courts have their own guiding principles, just like drug courts. But if you look at reduced recidivism, DWIs are funny. They're a whole different breed of person who gets a drunk driving case. That's not the correct terminology, but you know what I mean. About 75% are never going to do it again. They're sufficiently humiliated. It's going to cost them a lot of money. They're going to lose their license for a while. They'll have to put an ignition interlock device on their car. 75% are never going to cause you another bit of trouble. So there's not much you need to do with them. Don't give them treatment. Don't do all this stuff. They don't need it. You could go out and draw a circle on the sidewalk and say, stand there for 2 days, and it would be just as effective of most of what we do. That 25%, however, those are your hardcore recidivists. And if you don't identify them and do an intervention early, they will continue to recidivate and kill people. And if you look at the arrest rates after somebody has gone through a DWI court, you can see that the business as usual is the orange bar, which is twice to 4 times as large as the blue bar. And that's in 3 different sites. We also have the Michigan study that looked at all these different courts, and the rearrest rate was 19 times greater for offenders that were sentenced traditionally and didn't have the court. Georgia, they studied the heck out of the courts in Georgia. Same thing. 4-year, 3-site study prevented between 47 and 112 incidents. And finally, the Orange County, California study. They have a wonderful DUI court down there. I wish we had it here. 21% of second offense drunk drivers and 25% of third-timers were convicted of a subsequent offense. However, if they went through the DWI court, it was 4.6%. I mean, just astounding. So this model has now spread all over the world, from Samoa to Indonesia, Australia and New Zealand certainly, places like Canada, Scotland, Wales. They're just all over the place, and courts and judges and other people in criminal justice are very excited about this model. China is now looking at it. I was just corresponding this morning from a professor I know in Japan, and he's trying to get a Fulbright fellowship to study these things. So all over the world, people are looking at this model saying this tough on crime business is just absolute nonsense. And that was all true until May 14th. And then May 14th, that was the headline in the New York Times. Unity was emerging on sentencing, then came Jeff Sessions. We didn't know, really, what the Attorney General was going to do, how he was going to make changes with this new administration. We did know that he didn't much like marijuana smokers. He says good people don't smoke marijuana. He's never been for legalization of marijuana. Okay, fair enough. But what he did was so beyond that. What he did was he said to every deputy federal prosecutor, because there are no head prosecutors, he fired them all, as you will recall, Mr. Trump did. So we don't have heads of offices. So the second in command in the offices were told, be as harsh and punitive as possible when you're making charging decisions in drug cases. Exactly what I just spent 40 minutes telling you didn't work. That we've been there, we've spent too much money, we've ruined people's lives, and that's what he said. And he said further that unlike Attorney General Eric Holder, that was a soft on crime thing, and let's look at what Holder really did. Holder didn't say, no, you can't charge the maximum, or no, you can't go for the most punitive. What Holder said was, consider whether the most severe punishment available is fair and proportional. That was his directive. Just take a look. Is it fair that this kid who's 19 years old is going to go to prison for the rest of his life for this stupid 19-year-old mistake? That's all. Didn't say you couldn't charge it if you wanted to. Well, there was a federal judge in Tennessee who talked about a case he had where the kid was, it was a, like 20-year-old. He was offered a plea bargain, which would have put him in custody for 20 years. He said, absolutely not. Nonviolent offender. And so he went to trial. He lost, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison, because that's what the statute called for. He had no discretion. He finally, after many decisions like that, quit the bench because he couldn't stand it anymore, and he is now an advocate for prison reform and sentencing reform. He says, we ruined this kid's life for what? For a cache of drugs. When we first started eliminating the mandatory minimums, the population in federal prison went down 14%. Red states like Texas, Energy Secretary Rick Perry was the governor there. They did away with the harsh sentencing, no minimum mandatories, let judges be judges, support of drug courts. We had all this bipartisan support going on, and particularly from the so-called red states that said, we can't afford this, and it's stupid. We are not getting anything out of this. There's no bang for this buck. Congressional reaction was again sort of stunned. They had been working in this bipartisan manner. people as diverse as Rand Paul and Patrick Leahy jointly introduced a bill called the Justice Safety Valve Act on the Senate side. On the House side, it's also being introduced as well in a bipartisan fashion. And they're saying mandatory minimums are disproportionately unfair to minorities and low-income communities. We already have distrust from the African American community and the other communities of color about what we're doing in criminal justice. How in the world can we start talking about mandatory minimums again? So, it comes with a human cost. So their bipartisan approach is, let judges be judges. Don't hamstring this judge from Tennessee who has to sentence this kid to life. Let the judge rely on the circumstances of the crime, the circumstances of the victims, the circumstances of the individual, whether or not alternatives are possible. And there are times, like I said earlier, where you have to lock them up. They can't be among us. But most of the time, you can find something else to do. Robert Reich, you could hear him spinning in Berkeley as all this was going on 2 weeks ago. He really took Sessions on and said mandatory sentencing is unfair, it's costly, it doesn't make anyone safer, and it will just accentuate injustice. And he called Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General of the United States, a racist and ignorant. Pretty strong. The sentencing project director said, this is going exactly backwards of where we need to be going. This will again fill federal prisons with people convicted of low-level drug offenses serving excessive sentences. But probably my favorite quote out of all the brouhaha, and it's not over yet, believe me, was from former Attorney General Holder, and he says, the decision by Attorney General Sessions is an ideologically motivated, cookie-cutter approach that has only been proven to generate unfairly long sentences that are often applied indiscriminately and do little to achieve long-term public safety. The policy announced today is not tough on crime. It is dumb on crime. Thank you. Now, this is a picture of a drug court graduation. I used to invite the arresting officer to the graduation of the person that had been arrested and gone through the program. So that's Diana. The officer was a little surprised when she hugged him. I was thrilled by it, as you can see. I was pretty darn happy. And Diana, probably the thing I remember most about her, she had been on methamphetamine for a number of years. She had a 6-year-old son. And that particular Christmas, she was very excited about. I said, why are you so excited about Christmas? And she said, it'll be the first time I've ever seen my son open his presents from Santa. I said, how could that be? She said, oh, because I'd always be out running at night. I'd sleep all day. I've never seen him open his presents. So I asked her the next week, how'd it go? She said, oh, we were so excited, we woke up at 5 o'clock. And we went into the living room, and there were all the presents, and I got to see him open them, and it was just the most wonderful thing in the world. She says, he's not going to believe in Santa Claus much longer, so I'm glad that I was able to turn this around when I did. So that's what it should be looking like, and not that other sad face with $71,000 a year for most people.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
That was very informative. See you next year.